Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, also known as Major Green, and today I want to talk about Back to the Future, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, by the way. And because it's a comedy movie, I don't usually nitpick science fiction comedies because it's almost pointless to do that. If the movie is supposed to be silly, it's not supposed to be taken seriously, then it can get away with doing a lot more crazy and bizarre and stupid things without anyone complaining, as long as it's fun and funny. But once in a while it is fun to nitpick just for the sake of it, and maybe also to come up with excuses to explain it. So what are the logical problems in this movie? Well, first of all, the way the DeLorean time machine works. It always appears in the exact same place on Earth where it disappeared. Now, why is this a problem? Because, the planet is not really stationary. The planet is actually rotating around itself and around the sun, and our sun is rotating around the galaxy, and the whole galaxy is moving, so we're not actually stationary, we're in constant motion, and yet the DeLorean always appears in the same exact spot where it disappeared on the planet. And so I guess we could say maybe Doc programmed it that way, maybe it's somehow linked to the presence of the planet, it's somehow kind of glued to the position of the planet. But if that's the case, why should it go at 88 miles per hour to make the time jump if speed is really irrelevant? No matter which direction, so it doesn't even matter which direction the Earth is spinning. Maybe the time machine is somehow linked to the magnetic fields of the planet and stuff like that, so maybe we can come up with some elaborate explanation for that. I guess the number 88 was picked because the number 8 is kind of like the infinity symbol, so I guess that was the reason, and because it just sounds cool, I guess. Another problem in the movie is the way that time travel works, which is a common problem in a lot of science fiction dealing with time travel. The whole issue of paradoxes, time loops, alternate timelines. I can rarely find any example of a movie that really did it right. There are sometimes movies with the perfect time travel story, meaning it's always a perfect loop and nothing is violated. No new timelines get created, but it's kind of boring, to be honest. Like, I'm not sure I like that idea of a clean time travel. And I don't think that's how it would work like in reality if time travel was possible. I don't think it would be that clean. It would also basically mean there is no free will, that you are unable to escape what was predetermined, and so I don't really like that idea. And I don't think it's true based on quantum mechanics and what we know about probability. I think there is free will in the sense of choices being made not even by people but even by particles. The universe is not deterministic, and so I don't like that idea of a perfect time travel story, of a perfect loop where nothing ever changes. And so it is interesting. Sometimes there were some good movies with that idea, but I don't think it should work like that. On the other hand, in movies like this, in which there are paradoxes, meaning someone from the future kills his own parents or prevents his parents from meeting in this case, and then he begins to disappear gradually, it kind of violates the rules of physics. Obviously, matter and energy cannot just appear and disappear. It would make no sense, and even if that was possible, wouldn't him disappearing mean that he never existed? And so if he never existed, then he wouldn't have prevented his parents from meeting, which means they do meet, which means he does exist. And so it doesn't really make sense. It cannot be both. Either he existed or he didn't exist. I guess we can say in stories like this, there is kind of like a Schrodinger effect, meaning he did exist up until the point he changed the past, and then he ceases to exist maybe sometime later, but people still remember him existing, so they do remember the reason they never met. In this case, because a guy called Marty stopped them, and then that guy disappeared, and they don't know why, they don't understand why he vanished to thin air, but only we understand. Again, I don't think that's how it would work like in real life. I think most likely if time travel was possible, I think the time traveler would not disappear. I think he would have created a new timeline in which his parents are not together and he's never born, but he would still exist from the future because he's technically like from another universe. So he would not disappear no matter what he does in the past. He would still be able to live on in this new timeline. That's how I personally think time travel would work if it was possible in reality. And this way it would not create any paradox, it would not make him vanish into thin air, which violates the rules of physics, so that way it would all make sense much more. It might be a more boring movie if that was the case, because there's nothing to worry about, but speaking purely scientifically, I think that's how it would have happened in real life. But for a movie, it's much more fun to see him, being on the clock to try to get his parents hooked up back together so he doesn't disappear, and he sees the photo in which he's disappearing, which is another silly thing in this movie. I mean, if he disappears in the photo, then shouldn't the photo itself also disappear? It was especially silly in the third movie in which they photographed a grave, and then the name on the grave disappeared, but the grave itself remained. So shouldn't the grave itself disappear if no one was killed? And shouldn't the photo itself also disappear, since why would anyone take a photo of the ground where there is no grave? I guess maybe it would have happened later. It kind of happens by stages, like the changes in the timeline kind of catch up to them gradually. And this is also the way that time travel was done oftentimes on Star Trek and in other movies like Looper, for example. Kind of silly time travel rules, but it does make for a good movie, I admit that. And time travel in itself is a violation of the rules of physics, so if that is possible, then I guess all these other strange things are also possible. And another logical problem in this movie is that in the end of the day he did get his parents back together, but all the events did not happen exactly the same as they originally were, and when he came back to the future, he basically arrived at a new timeline in which his father was a different person, he was much more confident, his life was very much different. But first of all, shouldn't there be another Marty when he comes back to the future? It's not really his own original timeline, he arrived at a different timeline where another Marty must have been born. And so shouldn't he still be there, unless at exactly the same time he also used the time machine and vanished? But it couldn't have become him, because then his memories would be different, and he would not be surprised by the new timeline. So where did that other Marty go? Did he also end up in a different timeline to his original one? So it's a bit fishy as well. There should have been another Marty living there, and then he would have to go into exile basically, or just stay with the two Martys living together. So that's another logical problem in this movie. And another big problem is that it should not really be the same Marty who was born in the new timeline, and his brother and sister also should have been different genetically, because how likely is it that exactly the same sperm cells impregnated Lorraine to produce the same exact children identical as in the original timeline? I mean, even if they had sex at exactly the same time, which is unlikely also since all the events as we saw are different to the original version, but let's assume they had, limited time and place to have sex, so maybe they did it at exactly the same time, and Lorraine's egg would be the same in that scenario, because, the egg goes out into the womb once a month, so half of the DNA of the embryo would be exactly the same, but George's sperm cells cannot possibly be the same exact sperm cell that fertilizes that egg. And so in the new timeline, all their children should be different. It should be basically a genetic sibling of the original, maybe even very similar one because it was from the same egg, but it should still be a different person. So it shouldn't be Marty in the new future, and his brother and sister should look at least slightly different, not just dressed differently, but actually be genetically different. They should be their genetic brother and sister. But not the same exact ones. One possible way we can explain this biologically is that maybe George has some kind of mutation, and that all his sperm cells are exactly the same genetically. I guess we cannot say he always has the same sperm cells, because then he wouldn't be able to produce both boys and girls, and he has 3 children, and one of them is female, and the other brother doesn't look like Marty. So we cannot say that he always has the same exact sperm cells, but maybe we can say, okay, in this year he has the same exact genes in all his sperm cells, and maybe a few years later it will be slightly different genes, but all his sperm cells will be identical. And so such a mutation, which I don't think exists by the way, but let's assume in this universe it's possible. In that case, what we saw in this movie would make sense, that the same exact children would be born even if the timeline is radically different. Actually, now that I think about it, we never actually got to see the other Marty close by. We saw him from a distance, but we didn't actually see him in any kind of close-up, so maybe we can assume maybe it was a genetically different version of Marty, but we did see his brother and sister, and they were dressed differently, but they looked exactly the same, so maybe they should have actually used other actors. It would have actually been more clever. And ironically, in the next movie, they did replace the actors for Jennifer, Marty's girlfriend, and for his father, George. Those were other actors playing them in the other movies, and they did it well so that we don't even notice. Maybe that's how it should have been done with his siblings in the end of the first movie. Just hire actors very similar to the first ones, and maybe we won't even notice that. But if we want to nitpick this movie and we compare them, then we'll see that actually these are slightly different versions of them. So maybe they are genetically not the same, and then it makes perfect sense. So I think it would have been more interesting maybe, and would have made much more sense if when Marty came back to the present day, he would see a different Marty living in his house, and he would look slightly different, and maybe his parents wouldn't even recognize him because he looks different. Maybe they wouldn't know who he is, and then he would have to basically go into exile from his family. So maybe he would go and live with Doc since he doesn't have a home anymore. And maybe it would actually open up new possibilities for him to actually time travel, because since he's now disconnected from any lineage, maybe he no longer has to worry about screwing up anyone's lineage in the past, because he's already from a different timeline, since there is a different Marty now, and his parents don't recognize him now, and so maybe now he'll be free to be the perfect time traveler. And also it would fix another logical problem in this movie, and that is how come George and Lorraine never wondered how come this third child of theirs looks exactly like Calvin Klein, whom they met 30 years ago. I guess maybe they forgot how he looked like. Wouldn't George be kind of worried, like, wouldn't he think if he does remember Marty? And obviously he does remember him. He even wrote a book about that whole incident with an alien bringing them together, which is based on what Marty did when he dressed up in the radiation suit and pretended to be an alien. So obviously George does remember those events. So if he remembers Marty's face, and then he sees his son Marty growing up, and then looking exactly like him, wouldn't he suspect maybe Lorraine is cheating on him? Wouldn't he come to Lorraine and ask her, say, did you cheat on me with that guy Calvin Klein that you met 30 years ago? Did you meet him again 17 years ago, and is he the father of Marty since he looks exactly like him? So I think I covered most of the logical problems in the first movie. Let's now move to the second movie. Right from the beginning of the movie, the biggest problem I think regarding the time travel is that shouldn't Marty not be in the future if he jumped to the future? The way they showed the time machine working in the first movie when he made the experiment with the dog, with Einstein, he showed that when he sends the dog to the future, then the dog basically skips that 1 minute he sent him to, and so the dog does not exist in that 1 minute. But let's say he sent the dog to a year in the future. Obviously he would not have the dog with him throughout that whole year, so when the dog arrives in the future there will not be a second dog there, right? So how come when he takes Marty to the future, there's another Marty there who is older? Once he took him into the time machine, he basically disappeared from the universe until he reappeared in the future. So there shouldn't be an old Marty in the future, and he shouldn't have any kids and so on. So that's one problem. I guess we can rationalize that by saying that because Marty later returned to the present and he did live his life, then he does exist in the future, so it's not a problem. But how could the time machine know that he will get back? What if he didn't go back suddenly? What if while he was in the future, he suddenly decided not to go back to the past? So would his other self, his older self, disappear the moment he makes that decision not to go back? Now, one way to solve this problem is that, remember when I said there should be two Martys in the end of Back to the Future 1? Because it's a new timeline, and so there should be a new and different Marty in that new reality. So when he comes back to the present from the past, he should not be the only Marty, there should be a second Marty. But what if that second Marty was simply not home at that time, and so maybe he did exist in that new timeline and we simply didn't see him, and then Doc arrived and took our Marty to the future. So technically that other Marty should still exist in that timeline, and then it wouldn't be a problem to have the Marty in the future. We can just say it's the Marty from that new timeline which was created in the end of Back to the Future 1, and so that's the one way to solve it. So we can just assume there was actually a second Marty in the end of the first movie which we just didn't see. So it's not really a problem, it's actually a nice way that this movie actually solved that issue of the two Martys. So one of the Martys was simply taken into the future, then back to the past. Now the real problem is with Jennifer, because Jennifer never time traveled until the second movie, and so there should only be one Jennifer. And so when they take Jennifer to the future, then there shouldn't be an older Jennifer there. Unless for some reason there was again two Jennifers. Ironically, they actually changed the actress of Jennifer. If you look closely, it's not the same actress in the second movie. They dressed her up the same and the same hair and so on, so it's almost not noticeable. But it's actually a different actress. So maybe we could argue maybe there are actually two Jennifers as well. Maybe there was some other time travel stuff going on which we didn't see. Maybe another Jennifer existed as a result from all these multiple timelines, and that's how she also exists as an old woman in the future. So that's one way to solve all of that. But I guess the idea of the movie was that simply the time machine knew that they will later go back in time, and therefore they can exist in the future. But that would kind of mean a deterministic time travel, meaning you can't really change anything. It's always perfect closed loops which don't affect each other, so no new timelines. So that's how it would work like in a deterministic kind of time travel, which is not the way it's been done in these movies, because we see that they can actually change the past, and people and objects can physically disappear as a result, and so that's why it's a bit of a mess with the whole idea of them existing in the future even though they jump to the future. Another big plot hole in this movie is later when Biff steals the time machine and takes it to the past to give that sport book to himself, and then he returns to the future. He returns to the same future where Marty and Doc are, so nothing changed when he returned to the future. So that's also a very big problem, probably the biggest plot hole in this movie, because if he came back to the past, gave himself the sport book, so from that moment there should have been a new timeline, so when Biff traveled into the future, he should have arrived in the future of the new timeline in which he was rich, and there should have been two versions of him in that future, meaning the original old guy version and an older and richer version of himself as well. But instead he arrived at the same timeline that he left, just so that Marty and Doc can use the time machine. Otherwise they would not get it back and they would be stuck in that timeline. So how can we explain these changes? Well, first of all, from what we've seen in these movies, the changes in the timeline don't happen right away. For example, in the first movie, when Marty saved George from being hit by the car and therefore he never met Lorraine, if the changes in the timeline would have been immediate, then Marty should have immediately disappeared, which would create a paradox, of course, because then who saved George? But in these movies, apparently, you physically disappear, but you exist up until that point, so I guess they would simply see him disappearing, and they would remember him from before he disappeared. So that's the way the time travel rules seem to work in these movies, that objects physically disappear, but not as if he never existed. So as we saw in that movie, we saw that only gradually it starts to affect him. He starts to look at the photo of his family, and his brother and sister slowly begin to disappear until he also starts to disappear. I guess because he was born the latest one. I guess it was by order, and only in the end of the movie he started to physically disappear as well. So in these movies, apparently it takes time for the changes in the timeline to take their effect, and therefore the characters have time to try to fix whatever went wrong. So it's as if time itself is giving them a chance to correct it, and therefore we can say the same thing happened in the second movie when Biff came back in time and gave himself the book. He immediately went back into the future, and maybe the change in the timeline didn't reach the future yet. Maybe the young Biff didn't make his mind yet on whether or not he should actually be using that book, because we saw that he kind of throws it away, he doesn't really believe in it. So maybe in the moment that the old Biff traveled back to the future, the timeline was still the same as it was, and so he arrived in the same exact future that he left. And maybe if Marty and Doc didn't immediately go into the time machine and go back, if they waited a while in the future, then eventually they would have seen the future change, but it would take a while for that to happen. Also, there was an interesting deleted scene in which we saw the old Biff disappearing after he arrived in the future. And I heard somewhere that that was because Lorraine eventually shot Biff, and so he was dead by the time of 2015. And so when we see him returning to the future, he almost immediately disappears as a result, which is a bit of a logical mess, so I'm glad they cut off that scene. We did see in the final version of the movie that he does seem to be kind of sick when he goes out, but there is no indication that it's because of time travel. Maybe he's just old and sick. Maybe it's because he hit himself with that stick or whatever, so we see him kind of in pain and struggling and going away. We don't see him disappearing in the actual movie, so I think we can dismiss that plot hole. If he would have disappeared on screen, it would have created a whole new problem, I think. Especially because that would mean the changes in the timeline already reached him, and therefore this whole environment should change, and Doc and Marty should notice something. So, but they don't notice anything, and then they go back into the time machine, and they go back to present day, to 85, and then they see that the timeline changed. So I guess by the time they arrived in the past, the change in the timeline already reached that present day, and then they figure out what happened, and then they go back to 55 to try to stop the change when it happened. And then Doc gets hit by lightning and travels back to the Old West, which should have created the most mess in the timeline, because all the things they did in the past could have had a significant effect in the future. And yet when they return home in the end of the third movie, everything seems to be fine, exactly like it was in the end of the first movie. But logically it should be yet another new timeline, because who knows how the changes they made in the past affected the future. And yet everything seems to be totally fine. And of course Doc got stuck in the past, and yet somehow he was able to build a new time machine out of a train, and he said that he already traveled into the future before going back to the past, and that's how he has that hovering technology. And another problem with these movies is that they show the future of 2015 and they had flying cars and all of that stuff, and yet it didn't happen in real life. So we can also debate the question, why didn't it happen the way the movie predicted it? And I actually have an interesting theory to explain all of that, and that's by saying that maybe Doc himself is the one who invented all that technology. in the original timeline. So if he had remained in 1985 and continued inventing new technology, then by the time of 2015, we would have seen that future that we saw with the flying cars and all that stuff. And there was even a scene showing him in the newspaper being congratulated by some other scientists. So it seems as if he's some kind of famous scientist in that timeline. And so maybe he's the one who actually invented all that stuff in the original timeline that we saw in the future segments of Back to the Future 2. But as we've seen in these movies, he never actually went back to present time. We never actually saw him again in the present, except stopping by with a time machine. So maybe because that he started time traveling, he basically disappeared from the timeline, and so maybe that's why he never invented all the technology we saw in 2015. Maybe it did get invented by other scientists later on in the future, so when he says he was already in the future in the end of the third movie, when he shows that he has the hovering technology, it doesn't have to be the same future in 2015. Maybe he jumped ahead to a century later, and that's where he got that technology. So we don't have to assume that the future had to happen as we saw it in 2015. Obviously, a lot of things would have been different. Marty was never in the accident, so he would not be the same Marty that we saw in that movie. And we can also use this excuse to explain why don't we have flying cars by now, because it's now way beyond 2015. And we don't have most of that technology, so we can explain all of that away by simply saying that was an alternate timeline in which Doc never used the time machine, and he's the one who invented all of that. And the moment he didn't return to the present, because he got stuck in the Wild West, and later he probably went on to explore other time periods, then he never came back to the present day and never invented all the technology, and eventually it was invented by other people later in the future. So that's my thoughts about the Back to the Future movies and its logical problems. Let me know what you think in the comments below and we can discuss it in the comment section. I hope it was fun to listen to and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.